The last thing Maren Voss expected to feel after 3 years of silence was afraid. Fear had burned out of her somewhere around month 7. That was when the last radio beacon on the eastern shelf went dead mid-sentence. A woman's voice, steady and clinical, reporting atmospheric readings, and Maren had sat with her ear pressed to the speaker for 6 hours waiting for the signal to resume. It never did. After that, she stopped fearing quiet. Quiet became the texture of the world. Quiet was breakfast, and the long walk, and the hours spent mapping corridors she already knew by heart, and the shallow sleep that passed for night. She was not afraid of silence. She had made her peace with it the way you make peace with a scar, by pressing on it until it stopped hurting. What frightened her now was the sound, a footstep. Distant, behind the ridge of collapsed highway overpass, somewhere in the rust-colored dust that passed for a landscape here. A single, unmistakable displacement of debris. The kind of sound that said, wait, the kind that said, alive. Maren pressed her back against the concrete pylon and did not breathe. She was not built for combat. She had been a xenobiological survey specialist before the Keth arrived, which meant her primary qualifications were patience, a high tolerance for tedium, and an ability to draw cellular structures by hand when the imaging equipment failed. None of this helped her now. What helped her now was the length of rebar she'd been using as a walking stick for 11 months, which she raised slowly in both hands and held like something she had every intention of using. The footstep did not repeat. Then, another one closer. She made herself breathe, slow, the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count the seconds, and remember that the dark has no opinions about you. The dark does not want anything. The dark is just the absence of light, and light is something you can always make. Her father had been an optimist. He had also been dead for 3 years, along with everyone else. The shape that came around the base of the overpass was not human. She had known it wouldn't be. Humans didn't move like that, too fluid, the joints bending at angles that suggested a skeleton drawn by someone who had only heard skeletons described. The Keth drone was low to the ground, six-limbed, its surface the color of old bruising, deep purple shading to sickly green at the joints. It moved in the silence of something that had never needed to be quiet because there had never been anything left worth alarming. It had not seen her. Maren did not move, did not blink, did not allow herself to think about the fact that a Keth drone on a survey route meant a Keth ground unit within 4 kilometers, and a Keth ground unit meant a relay signal, and a relay signal meant the orbital platform would know within minutes that something warm and alive was breathing behind this pylon. She counted its steps, watched the movement pattern. Her survey training clicking in, unbidden. She had spent 3 years of her career cataloging the feeding cycles of bioluminescent cephalopods, and the professional habit of watching, measuring, noting did not care that the subject had changed. The drone moved in an expanding spiral, which meant it was executing a standard area saturation search. It was not looking for her specifically. It was looking for anything. The Keth had been thorough. After the initial assault, the orbital bombardment that had glassed the cities, the ground phase that had cleared the rubble. They had swept the continent 4 times in the first year. By the second year, the sweeps had grown infrequent. By the third year, almost perfunctory, because there was almost nothing left to find. The drone passed within 8 meters of her position without pausing. She watched its rear limbs until they disappeared around the far side of the pylon's shadow. She listened to the soft percussion of its movement fade into the hiss of wind across broken concrete. She stood perfectly still for another 4 minutes, counting heartbeats. Then she moved. Not running. Running was sound and heat and visibility. She moved the way she had learned to move in months after the collapse. Low, measured, deliberate, her boots placed with the care of someone who understood that a loose piece of rubble could be the difference between alive and not. She had worn through 2 pairs of boots in 3 years. The ones she wore now had been resoled with strips of tire rubber she'd cut from a chassis in the logistics depot 3 kilometers east. They were ugly, they worked, she kept the rebar low. The depot had been her base for 19 months, long enough to know every entry point, every structural weakness, every place where the roof was likely to come down without warning. It occupied what had been a municipal works yard, which meant it was surrounded by the kind of infrastructure humans built when they expected things to last. Reinforced concrete, deep footings, a drainage system that still functioned. She had extended the drainage tunnels in her first winter there, boring through the soft earth with a hand auger salvaged from a maintenance shed, creating 3 additional exit routes that nothing the size of a Keth ground unit could follow her through. The drone had been heading north. She went south. She found the secondary entrance, a gap she'd cut in the chain link with a bolt cutter, disguised with a hanging sheet of corrugated metal, and slipped through without touching the metal. She'd practiced that. The sound of metal on metal carried 200 meters in still air. She had measured it. Inside, she let herself stop. The depot's interior was large enough to have its own microclimate. Cooler than outside, the air faintly metallic with the smell of old oil and the particular damp that came from her water collection system. A network of gutters and catch basins she'd assembled across the roof over the course of her second summer, routed down through a repurposed industrial pipe. She had clean water. She had a heating element she'd extracted from a commercial kitchen unit and rigged to a small solar accumulator. She had seeds and growing medium in the eastern corner, under a UV lamp that ran 4 hours a day at minimum consumption. She had, in the depot's eastern office, approximately 9,000 handwritten pages of observation, documentation, and what she privately called her theoretical work, because calling it hope felt like pushing her luck. She sat down on the cot she'd built from pallets and scavenged foam and allowed herself 3 minutes to shake. It was something she'd started doing early, giving the shaking a defined window. 3 minutes. She set the timer on the manual watch she'd taken from the wrist of a man she'd found in the first weeks, dead in a parking structure, his face peaceful in the specific way of people who had simply run out of reasons to continue. She'd taken the watch. She'd buried him in the soil near the depot's south wall and planted a bean seedling on the disturbed earth, because it was the only ceremony she had available, and she'd been raised to believe that humans marked their dead. 3 minutes of shaking. Then she wound the watch, drank from the waterline, and went back to work. Work was the only thing that had kept her functional. Not survival work. Survival was automatic, metabolic, the body's stubborn insistence on continuing. Work was the documentation. The observation logs, the material catalogs, the maps of Keth patrol routes that she'd been building for 37 months, using nothing but direct observation. A compass, a measuring wheel, and an encyclopedic memory for spatial relationships. The Keth moved in patterns. Every intelligence moved in patterns. The patterns were information, and information was leverage, and leverage was, she stopped herself, as she always did at this point in the thought, because the next word was power, and power implied an application of force, and she was one person with a rebar and a UV lamp. But she kept the maps. That night, in the hour before she allowed herself sleep, she sat with the patrol maps spread across the office floor and looked at the data she had from the drone's appearance. Its entry vector, its search pattern, the direction of its departure. She added these to the record and updated her probability distribution for patrol density in the northern sector. The Keth had not found her. She did not know why. She had theories. The depot's thermal management, deliberate, obsessive, meant she presented minimal infrared signature. The Keth sensor suite, based on what she'd observed and on the pre-collapse intelligence reports she'd memorized before the servers went down, prioritized heat and electromagnetic activity. She produced little of either. She had also been extremely, exhaustingly careful. 3 years of extremely exhausting care. But luck was also a factor. She acknowledged this. It would have been unscientific not to. She folded the maps and went to sleep. The signal came 3 weeks later. She almost missed it. She was in the southern tunnel, the longest of the 3 exit routes she'd bored, which she used as a cold storage corridor, sorting through her seed inventory, and the sound reached her attenuated by distance and earth. a rhythmic percussion. Not mechanical, not the flat, overlapping frequencies of Keth drone movement. Something irregular, something. Her brain supplied the word before her conscious mind caught up. Deliberate. She was back in the depot and at the observation slit in the north wall in 4 minutes flat. The figure in the dust was human. She knew it immediately. The way you know a thing that has been absent so long its return is physically shocking, a kind of vertigo that starts in the chest and radiates outward. The figure was tall, moving slowly, carrying something across the shoulders, a pack, heavily loaded, and walking with the gait of someone who had walked very far and intended to walk further, moving south, moving toward the depot. Her first instinct was to hide, her second instinct arriving half a second later with the weighty years of solitude behind it, was not. She spent 45 minutes watching. The figure moved without urgency, pausing occasionally to consult something, a compass or a map, and then continuing. The movement pattern was not erratic. It did not suggest injury or disorientation, it suggested purpose. It also, and this was important, suggested someone who knew how to move through a landscape without presenting a target, because the figure used cover without appearing to think about it, skirting the open spaces, following the shadow lines. Marin had not spoken aloud to another human being in 37 months. She went to the gap in the fence. She stood there for a long moment. The figure was 200 meters out, angling slightly east. If it continued on that bearing, it would pass without seeing her. She would remain invisible. She would remain safe. She stepped out from behind the corrugated metal and stood in the open and waited. He saw her at 140 meters. She watched him stop. Watched the way his whole body became still. Not the stillness of prey, she noted, but the stillness of someone assessing. He stood for almost a full minute. Then he turned and walked toward her. She raised the rebar, not threateningly, she hoped. Not threateningly, but honestly. After 3 years alone, she was not entirely certain she still understood the full range of human social signals. He stopped at 20 meters. He was older than she'd expected, weathered, the face carrying the specific geography of extended outdoor exposure. He had a beard that had grown beyond intention into simple fact. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize, because it was layered in a way that suggested he was experiencing several things simultaneously, and at least one of them she recognized from the inside. He was relieved. He raised his hand not up, sideways, palms out, a gesture that said clearly, "I know how this looks, and I am not a threat." She had used that gesture herself once, 12 months ago, when she'd startled a feral dog in a collapsed kitchen, and the dog had looked at her with exactly the expression she suspected she was currently wearing. "My name is Danilo," he said. His voice was hoarse with disuse. She recognized that too. "Marin," she said. Her own voice came out rougher than she'd expected. She cleared her throat. "How long?" He understood the question. 31 months, he said. Since the last person. She lowered the rebar. He had traveled from the west, from the coast, where he'd sheltered in a marine research station through the first winter, then moved inland when the Keth established a coastal monitoring station close enough to make his position untenable. He had been moving east for 7 months. He had a system for evading the patrols, different from hers but with the same underlying logic. He had a set of handwritten maps. He had a theory. The theory took him 3 hours to explain clear and filled 6 pages of her journal as she wrote while he talked, because she had learned not to trust her memory when it came to ideas that mattered. The core of it was this. The Keth were not looking for stragglers. The Keth were not managing residual human population the way a military doctrine would suggest. They were doing something that, in 3 years of observation, he had come to believe was something closer to waiting. "Waiting for what?" she asked. "For us to finish," he said. She looked at her own maps, 37 months of patrol data. The frequency curves, the density gradients, the slow, almost imperceptible shift she'd noticed in the last 6 months. The patrols were thinning, not locally. Everywhere, across every route she'd managed to observe. "They think we're done," she said. "They think," he said, "that the residual population is below the threshold of organized resistance. They're waiting for biological attrition to complete the work. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the dead plain with the sound of something practicing patience. "Are they wrong?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. "I found you," he said. "I wasn't even looking for you specifically. I was following the drainage engineering. The modified runoff pattern near your north wall. Someone had rerouted the watershed, and I thought, a human mind did this. I followed the line of the thinking. That was sloppy of me. That," he said, "is not what I would call it." They talked through the night. She showed him the patrol maps. He showed her his. The combined data set was substantially more powerful than either alone. Different observation windows, different sectors, different angles on the same systemic pattern. Together they could see what neither had been able to see alone. The Keth patrol infrastructure was not a security network. It was a harvest schedule. They were sweeping for resources, energy signatures, usable materials, and the sweeps were becoming infrequent because the easily detectable resources had already been catalogued and collected. What they were not looking for, because they had assessed it as exhausted, was a coherent human intelligence. They made a mistake, Marin said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. They underestimated persistence, Danilo said. She thought about her father, about optimism, about light being something you could always make. "There are others," she said. It was not a question. He had come from the West. She had been stationary. 2 data points did not make a pattern, but 2 people, each of whom had survived 30-odd months through applied intelligence and stubbornness, suggested a distribution. Suggested that the Keth's threshold for residual population was wrong. Suggested that the biological attrition they were banking on had encountered an obstacle. Humans were extremely, unreasonably difficult to kill. "There are others," he agreed. "And they're each building their own version of this," she said, gesturing at the depot, "the maps, the 9,000 handwritten pages. Probably. And none of them know about the others. Not yet." She looked at the waterline, at the UV lamp cycling through its morning startup sequence, at the patrol maps with their accumulated 37 months of data, dense and precise, a document of everything the Keth had decided to stop worrying about. "Then we need a signal," she said. "A signal means detection risk. A signal means we stop waiting for attrition and start being an inconvenience." She spread her hands over the maps. "They think they've won because they haven't heard from us, so we become the thing they can't unhear." She paused. "Not loud. Loud gets you killed. Quiet and persistent and coordinated. Something they can't attribute to a single survivor. Something that says, 'You miscounted.'" He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a person recalculating, the specific focus of someone adjusting a long-held assessment. "I've been moving," he said slowly, avoiding contact, being invisible. "I know. So have I. Being invisible assumes they're right about us. Yes." The wind shifted outside, carrying the particular taste of morning in the wasteland, dust and cold and the faint mineral tang of the dead plain. Marin looked at the gap in her east wall where she'd been meaning, for months, to install a better insulator. She'd been saving the materials, waiting for the right moment, planning it carefully. She had been extraordinarily good at not being seen. She had never stopped to ask herself what she was saving it for. "There's a relay station," she said, 7 kilometers northeast. "I've had it mapped for 2 years. The Keth use it for their western sector coordination. I don't know if I can interface with the hardware, but I know what it looks like, and I know the patrol gap." She looked at him. "I've known where it is for 2 years. Why haven't you?" "I was waiting," she said. "I don't know what I was waiting for." She thought she did know, actually. She had been waiting for the thing she'd needed all along. The thing that was not fuel or shelter or seeds or water, the thing that sat above all of those in the hierarchy of necessary things. She had been waiting for someone to build the plan with, not because she couldn't build it alone. She had been building it alone for 37 months, but because some plans are not made for one person. Some plans require the basic human technology of another mind. "We can't Danilo said. "If we transmit, they locate us in minutes." "We don't transmit," she said. "We listen." We document what we intercept, we compile, and then we transmit once. Burst, transmission, everything we have, every map, every patrol schedule, every vulnerability assessment, everything. And we moved before they can triangulate. She looked at the 9,000 pages stacked in the Eastern office. 37 months of observation, your 31 months. If there are others, and I believe there are others, a burst transmission on a frequency they'd recognize as human-made. Would find them, he said. Would find them, she said, and give them everything we have, so they're not starting over. He was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read, because it contained, she thought, something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and has just been offered help. She understood that expression perfectly. She was feeling it herself. It's a significant risk, he said. Yes. We might not make it out of the transmission window. Yes. He looked at the maps, at the data, at the evidence of two people's meticulous, stubborn, infuriated refusal to be finished. Okay, when do we go? She checked the patrol schedule, overlaid his data with hers, identified the gap, turned the watch over in her hands, the watch she'd taken from a dead man and used to measure out 3 minutes of fear at a time, the watch that had been with her for 37 months as she built, alone, something that could only be completed with someone else. Tomorrow night, she said. 63-hour window, we move at hour 40 of the gap, transmit at hour 50, move out on the opposite bearing at 52. He studied the schedule. He did not rush it. He was the kind of person who did not rush things that mattered. Liked that, she made a note of it. 40, 50, 52, he said. That works. She started packing the maps. The relay station was exactly as she had documented. A low-profile installation set into the bedrock, disguised under 3 meters of debris that would not fool a careful human eye but was evidently persuasive at altitude. The Keth engineers had not apparently anticipated anyone taking the time to look carefully from the ground. The patrol gap held. They moved through it with the economy of people who had spent years learning that every unnecessary movement was an argument against survival. The interface was alien in the most literal sense, a design built by minds that processed information through mechanisms she could not entirely model. She'd brought every tool she had, which was not very many. She'd brought primarily 37 months of careful observation and the specialized stubbornness of someone who had once spent 4 months learning to read a cephalopod's bioluminescent communication patterns because the alternative was giving up. And giving up had never been an option she'd seriously entertained. She was inside the hardware in 50 minutes. What she found was more than she'd hoped for and less than she'd feared. The relay architecture was complex but not incomprehensible. Its underlying logic had the universality of physics. You cannot build a communications infrastructure without certain structural elements, whatever your biology, and she could follow the logic even where she couldn't read the specific notation. It was, she thought, a little like navigating a city in a language you'd never studied by reading only the street signs. Daniela watched the approaches and did not hurry her. She did not hurry. At the 50-minute mark, she had what she needed. Not just the passive intercept she'd planned for, but a carrier signal. An existing channel in the station's secondary routing, a low-priority diagnostic frequency that the automated maintenance system used for internal checks. A frequency no one was listening to because it was supposed to say nothing interesting. She was going to make it interesting. She compiled the burst. Everything. The maps, the patrol schedules, the vulnerability assessments, the water collection, schematics, the seed propagation data, the structural survey of the depot, 37 months of one person's defiant, meticulous insistence on paying attention. She added Danilo's 7 months of travel data. She formatted it in the simplest possible encoding, the kind of encoding that a human mind would recognize as intentional without needing a key. She added, at the very end, a single line of clear text, "We are here. You are not alone." She transmitted at hour 51. They were 2 kilometers away when the station lit up. They heard it, a change in the ambient electromagnetic texture of the air, subtle enough that she only recognized it because she'd spent months cataloging it. The station was active, querying, trying to localize the anomalous transmission. They were already moving. She did not look back. They moved south, following the route she'd planned, using the cover she'd mapped, hitting each waypoint in the sequence she'd worked out over the previous 20 hours. Danilo moved like someone who knew what he was doing, which was the only kind of person she was interested in working with. They did not speak. Speaking was a luxury for somewhere else. The depot, when they reached it through the secondary entrance, felt different, not smaller. She'd expected to feel the contraction that came with bringing someone else into a space you'd defined by yourself, the way a private space changes when it becomes shared. Instead, it felt larger, in the specific way of things that have found their purpose. They sat on the floor. The cot was not built for two, a problem she was already thinking through, and Marin unscrewed the cap of the waterline and passed it to Danilo first. It was a small thing. It was the smallest possible version of something that had once been ordinary, the reflexive hospitality of a species that had evolved in groups, and knew, somewhere below conscious thought, that the group was the survival mechanism. He drank, passed it back, she drank. Outside in the dark and the dust, the testing algorithms were running and rerunning their localization routines, finding nothing, logging an anomaly, deprioritizing it. The patrol schedule would not change for another 11 hours. The burst transmission was already propagating through the relay network, bouncing through the infrastructure the Keth had built to coordinate their sweep. An infrastructure that was, it turned out, excellent for carrying a message to every corner of the continent they had decided was empty. She thought about the others. She thought about them waking to a signal on a frequency that should have been silent, a signal that was clearly intentional, clearly human, carrying everything she and Danilo knew. She thought about them reading the patrol maps and recognizing their own observations in the data. She thought about a xenobiologist who'd spent 3 years talking to no one, and a man who'd spent 31 months moving west to east, and all the others she couldn't yet name, each of them alone, each of them building something that could only be finished together. The Keth had concluded that the threshold had been passed. They had decided, with the confidence of a species that had done this before, that the residual population was no longer relevant. They had scheduled the final sweeps. They were waiting for time to complete what they had started. They had not accounted for the specific, unreasonable human conviction that the next breath is worth taking. They had not accounted for 37 months of documentation. They had not accounted for the instinct that says, before you die, leave a map. They had not accounted for what happened when two people, each of whom had refused alone, discovered the other. Marin leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the depot. Her depot, the space she had made livable one problem at a time over nearly 4 years, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was not safety. Safety was a long way off, a project for the people who would receive the burst transmission and the ones they would find, and the ones after that. It was not happiness. Happiness was too light a word for something this serious. It was purpose, the specific, bone-deep satisfaction of a thing you built finding its use. She closed her eyes. In the eastern office, the handwritten maps waited in their neat stacks. 37 months of one woman's refusal to concede the point. Somewhere across the ruined continent, on frequencies the Keth had built, but forgotten to listen to, the signal traveled. We are here. You are not alone.